Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Oregon League of Conservation Voters Youth Climate Roundtable. A quick announcement about Zoom before we get started. This conversation is being recorded. For those who would like a live transcript of the roundtable, you can do so by pressing the CC button. And a reminder to stay muted while you are not speaking. Zoom logistics aside, tonight we are very excited to be joined by Representatives Khanh, Pham, and Representative Marsh, who are both climate champions in our state legislature. My name is Yassine, and I'm a high school intern with the OLCV, and I'll be one of your MCs tonight.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll also be one of your MCs. I'm a college fellow with the OLCV. In just a few minutes, we'll be asking our guest speakers a mix of pre-selected and your questions. So if you have any, please put them in chat. As a reminder, this is an inclusive space where hate of any kind is not tolerated. So be kind to your fellow attendees and our generous guest speaker panel. Before we jump in, the OLCV would like to share a land acknowledgement.
The Oregon League of Conservation Voters and our fellow co-hosts work to protect people and places on the ancestral lands of the indigenous communities who built homes, economies, and trading routes across the land we now call Oregon. We would like to honor and acknowledge Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribes, who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. The Klamath tribe of the Southern Oregon Plateau, the Burns Paiute of the High Desert East, the Coquille of Southern Oregon's coastal forest, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde in the Northern Coast Range, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua in the Southern Oregon foothills, the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla in the Blue Mountains, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz in Oregon's northern rainforests, the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw on the windblown southern coast, and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs on the sunny eastern slopes of the Oregon Cascades. And we would like to recognize all other indigenous communities who have not been federally recognized. Oregon was built on broken treaties. The lasting effects of federal and state policies, both past and present, have put Native Americans at a disadvantage for hundreds of years. It is on all of us, whether we are descendants of colonizers or inhabitants of stolen land, to re-educate ourselves and each other. Together, we have the responsibility to push past recognition and demand land reparation and reparations to sovereign tribal nations and indigenous people across the state.
Thanks, Yassine. And now we'll let the guest speakers introduce themselves, starting with Representative Marsh. Rep. Marsh represents Oregon's 5th House District, which covers parts of Southern Oregon, including Ashland and Southern Jackson County. Rep. Marsh has sponsored and supported some of the most exciting climate legislation we've seen in the past few years. So please welcome Representative Pham Marsh.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Golly, it's great to be here with all of you. I was asked to introduce myself. I'll just give you a little bit about my district and a little bit about why I'm participating in this event tonight. So my district is in Southern Jackson County. Jackson County sits just above the California line. I live in the town of Ashland. Some of you may know it for the university, Southern Oregon University, and the Shakespeare Festival. I ran for office originally in 2016, so I'm in the middle of my 4th term. And when I ran with climate change as my most important issue. And I did so because I think if you live in or work in or recreate in our rural areas, as we do down here in my district, if your eyes are open, you are seeing the effects of climate change in the form of dissipated snowpacks and drought that is persistent and prolonged, and habitat changes. And then I got elected. We started to work on this, and a year later, my community suffered 6 weeks of choking smoke. I mean, smoke that was so thick that you couldn't go out, smoke that was so thick that people started to wonder if this was even a place they could live in the future. And then I knew that climate change, in fact, was really targeting our community. And then in 2020, we were part of the fires that coursed across the state of Oregon. In my community, the Alameda fire destroyed 2,500 homes of the 4,000 homes that were destroyed statewide. And in those were 1,500 or 1,600 manufactured homes, which are homes to our most vulnerable communities, our elders, our Latino Latinx families, our working families. And then we knew that not only was climate change targeting our community, it was in fact targeting our most vulnerable populations, just like we'd always heard it was going to. So my motivation has been reinforced over these years by actual experiences on the ground. And that's why I am obsessive on this subject and especially glad to be here with you.
Thank you so much. Now to Representative Pham. Representative Pham represents Oregon's 46th House District in Southeast Portland along 82nd Avenue, and she has been serving since 2021. Representative Pham championed the passage of many clean energy bills, including the country's most ambitious 100% clean energy standard. Please welcome Representative Pham.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pham. I'm the state rep for Oregon House District 46 in outer Southeast Portland. I use she or they pronouns, and I started out as a community organizer working with groups, including with OLCV when I was at Apano and at Opal. And it was my experiences, excuse me. Well, actually, I guess I would say for climate justice work, it was even before I started working in the Jade District. When I was 19, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Vietnam, and which is where my family is from, even though I was born here in the United States. And that was, even though that was over 20 years ago, it was a really formative experience for me. I got to meet people and really build really deep and meaningful relationships with people who were just living their life, people in my family who are just living their lives, but also having to face the impacts of just extreme heat and more hurricanes, constant flooding. And it just really, even back then, which it wasn't nearly as bad as it is now, but even back then, it was really clear who would be bearing the brunt of climate change. And we knew about it back then. And so I just came back really wanting to understand just the root causes of the climate crisis and why I saw so much economic inequality, which was intertwined. And I mean, that was probably the thing that first hit me. And so ever since then, I think I've been on a journey to really try to understand both how do we tackle global and economic inequality while also taking action on climate justice. And the good news is that we can do both.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both of you, for introducing yourselves. And now we're going to start our panel discussion, and then we'll move into an audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and there are people behind the scenes who will be pulling those. And we have some pre-selected questions we're going to do for a panel. So the first question to both of you is, what is your biggest priority when addressing the climate crisis?
Pam, do you want to go first and I'll go after?
Sure. My biggest priority is honestly right now telling the story over and over again, because we are confronted with people who are in denial, people who maybe see the signs but can't face the signs. And we need to keep bringing this home. This is, climate change. We used to think climate change was about disappearing islands across the globe. That would be bad enough certainly for those people. But what we understand is that climate change is right here. It is real, and it is targeting our most vulnerable populations, just as with the stories that I shared with you earlier. We have to keep telling that story. We have to keep bringing it home. We have to keep people understanding that this is not a matter of whether we're going to experience climate change. It's right here. The effects are draconian, and we are mandated to step in some way. So I think making it real is the most important thing that I can do right now.
And I would echo that. For me, I think there are so many ways to address the climate crisis on so many fronts. And I think it's important that we take a very holistic and intersectional approach when we think about taking action on the climate crisis. I think in Portland today, we are facing a real backlash against people who are unhoused. I think there is a real sense that there's a real conflation that unhoused people means drug addicts and criminals, and it's kind of conflating all of them as if they're the same, and really, I think, dehumanizing them. And I think it's so important that as we address the climate crisis, we're going to face more and more disasters. And it's so important that we hold on to our values in the midst of the strategies that we take to address the coming crises and disasters, that we don't let really fear mongering and kind of divisive, dehumanizing approaches be the dominant way. I think a lot of times when people are faced with scarcity or things that can be really scary, sometimes we lock down and want to dehumanize the stranger or the folks who are different or other. And I think one of my biggest priorities is trying to articulate the connections between different systems of oppression, and how can we hold on to how can we build a caring economy as we transition from this economy that's headed for collapse towards a more caring and just economy without sacrificing certain communities.
Thank you so much. So our next question is, we've passed 100% clean energy bills, resilient, efficient buildings, wildfire mitigation, natural climate solutions, and etc. So my question is, what's next for Oregon? And specifically, what are your plans to center marginalized communities in environmental policy and ensure Oregon's most vulnerable populations are protected from climate harms going forward?
Khanh, why don't you take this one first?
Yes. So for me, what's next for 2025? The legislative session is definitely transportation. We kind of punted this session, and the legislature did not take really strong action, with the exception of funding the Interstate 5 bridge and freeway expansion project. But 2025 is when it's clear there's broad consensus that we have a crumbling, we have a transportation system that now doesn't have enough money for maintenance. And so we've been underfunding maintenance for the past couple of years. We're facing a fiscal cliff, and transportation is also 40% of our state's greenhouse gas emissions, and it's 40% nationwide roughly as well. So it's clearly a huge sector. It has huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions and on the quality of our lives. As students and young people, you probably realize not everybody drives or can drive. 1 in 4 Oregonians, some people say 1 in 3 Oregonians cannot drive or don't want to drive because either they're too young, or they're too old, or they have a disability, or they can't afford how expensive cars are and how much it costs to maintain them. And so it is absolutely an equity issue. If we pour all of our money, all of our investments, all of our commons and our taxpayer dollars into only the people who have the money and the privilege to be able to drive. And we've found that there is an appetite in Oregon. There's been, and across the United States, there's been recent polling that says people do want us to invest in safety. They don't want to invest in just endlessly expanding freeways if it means that we then don't have money to fix the potholes, to seismically retrofit our bridges, and to invest in public transit that allows people access to opportunity to get to the jobs and get to school and get to healthcare, the places that they need to go. You shouldn't have to have a car. And so I'm really focused on transportation, really with an equity lens. As you said, we really have to center the most marginalized communities, recognizing that right now, the transportation system is the epitome of marginalizing low-income communities and communities of color. Like, all of the investments are just catered towards those with cars. And if you can't afford it, if you have to bike or walk or take the bus, you get a fraction of the investments that we make and the subsidies that we give to drivers. So I'm really looking to build a 2025 transportation package that engages all of these different constituencies, including young people, including folks with disabilities, including folks who are living in rural communities who need access to public transit but don't have it. What would it look like to have a world-class rail service between different cities in Oregon so that you could travel without a car? And so I'm really excited to hopefully work with OLCV in coming together with that package.
I want to applaud, we should pause and applaud Rep. Pham for her passion for this subject of transportation. It's not, transportation policy has not always been in the environmental realm. It's kind of been over in the corner with transportation nerds and highway people. And Khanh recognized a long time ago that it is a justice issue, it is an environmental issue, and that we really need to put it front and center on our environmental agenda. So thank you so much for that, Khanh. When I think of the work that we have to do, it's challenging because in some ways we've done the big headline kind of work. We passed 100% clean electricity. That was a big headline effort. We tried cap and invest a couple of times and failed on that. So that's, at this moment, we've set that aside. I think as we look at the path, we did buildings in this session. That was a big effort. Buildings, both our current and our future buildings, will consume about 40% of the energy in our environment. So you have buildings combined with transportation, and you've got a significant amount of the energy that we're consuming. When I think about building the agenda, I categorize it in a few different ways. First, I think of mitigation activities. That is, what are we going to do to actually address the presence of emissions in our environment to subdue the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing all these problems. But I've also been forced, frankly, to think of it about adaptation as well. What are we going to do as the climate changes to make sure that people are safe and healthy? A few years ago, I was never willing to think about adaptation because it felt to me like we were giving up on the real work, which is making sure that this climate change is corralled in some way. But then a year ago, or 2 years ago, we had the heat dome, and people died because it got so hot. We had more than 100 Oregonians who died that summer, probably many more than that, because there were many people who had underlying conditions that were exacerbated by heat. And so then I really started to think about the fact that we need to engage in strategies that will keep people safe as these conditions continue to change. Some of our strategies, like placing heat pumps in buildings, do both things. Heat pumps are the most energy efficient source of heating and cooling that people can possibly have. Those heat pumps, when they're in people's homes, will keep them well cooled in the summer and then keep them warm in the winter. So there is a health and a protective factor associated with the heat pumps. But we're also saving a lot of energy in doing so, and transferring people, in many cases, from very inefficient heating systems, sometimes gas heating systems, to new clean electricity, which and we're on the path to making sure that electricity comes from clean sources. So I think about the work in terms of mitigation and adaptation, and we're going to need some in both categories. And then I further parse the work in terms of the clean electric grid, because that's sort of bucket number one that we need to be working on. Buildings and natural gas, continuing work there, making sure that the programs are actually on the ground, that we've anticipated addressing natural gas in buildings. That's bucket number two for me. And then community resilience and environmental justice, which just permeate everything that we do, but also deserves a special attention of its own. So that's bucket number three. So I think, again, as we take a step back and look at what we've done, what's unrolling, what we need to invest in to make sure that programs that we passed are actually implemented, and what programs we need to put on the ground, I think we need to take a very structured look at all of this so that we can really see that the actions we are taking or the actions that we are planning are going to get us to where our greenhouse emission reduction goals actually sit in 2030 and then in 2050. So I can't name for you specifically what those programs are going to be, but I think the important thing is that we are planning and we are thinking in a systematic way to make sure that what we do is actually effective.
Thank you so much, both of you, for those really thoughtful answers. The next question is, how have you centered youth perspectives and wants and needs in your work this past legislative session?
Well, I'll start here. I think youth have, because people care about this and because youth have organized well, we are hearing the voices of youth in everything that we do. In my community, which is, again, Southern Oregon, Rogue Climate, which was really started by young people, started by founders who went to high school with my daughter, have always had a focus on youth and bringing in youth and making sure that those voices are well heard. In my community of Ashland, it is youth that demanded that we as a community step up and do climate planning. It is youth right now who are leading the effort to set this up as a community that is all about electrifying itself. I think sometimes the legislative process can seem pretty overwhelming and maybe pretty discouraging. And I think the important thing to recognize is that the legislative realm, of course, that's where Khanh and I work, but that's only one realm for effective climate action. There's a whole lot of other work that can be done and must be done in communities, in your schools, in your homes, to really bring people along and to make sure that the adults around you understand that this is an existential issue for youth. So I think youth are doing a terrific job being heard, and we need to continue that because we need your voices. Khanh, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that the next question also deals with youth voices. And so just why don't we move on to that one? And I can also address how youth can stay engaged.
Sure. So our next question is, besides internships and advocacy, how can young people who cannot vote engage in the legislative process and make their voices heard? And how are you ensuring that young voices are being heard and their issues are implemented into policy?
I think that's a great question, because I think the fact that young people cannot vote is really just minor. I think there's still many ways to build political power of youth voices. And so I would say internships are great for individuals. But I do think it's important to think about building collective power through organizations. I am a real believer in organizations to be able to, I think the times when I have felt the most powerless has been when I have been alone. I hate like reading climate stories alone, but when I'm with others learning about climate justice or learning about the climate crisis, I actually never feel hopeless, because I know that I'm with other people and that we share a vision, we share values, and I know that we're powerful. And so I would say developing your own agenda and vision and pushing politicians to sign on to it when they're running and looking for your endorsement. So I've seen Sunrise PDX really do that effectively. They've articulated, before I had even started talking about transportation, they were pushing, they invited me. I've actually grown a lot. I mean, I already always cared about transportation, but I wasn't on the transportation committee. But after the 2021 legislative session, they invited me to their rally outside of ODOT's offices and really pushed me on one of my votes on HB 3055. And I think they've just been, they're not voters per se, but they have organized, they do endorse candidates. They've become an organization that certain politicians do want. A lot of Democratic politicians do want their endorsement because adults are looking to them for their expertise and their values. And so I just think it's really important to be organized, whether in whatever way. That's one way, but I think the key is to make sure that you're not alone, or it's not just one or two people, but you're always thinking about how do we bring in more people. And high schools are a great place to organize because you're with a lot of young people and be like, oh, maybe I'll invite my friend so-and-so to the meeting, and just really thinking about how do we continue to always build our base so that we can build our collective power.
Great. So we have one more question for this section, and then we'll get into the audience Q&A. So a reminder to put any questions you have into the Zoom chat. And for our last panel question, in Oregon, we often see an urban-rural divide argument when it comes to climate issues. What strategies are you as legislators using, and how can we as advocates help bridge that divide and bring both urban and rural voices together to solve our biggest issues?
I'll take that one on because I think about this a lot. My district spans the I-5 corridor. So I have some very intense areas of density. But I also have up in the mountains, the tiniest K-12 school district in the state of Oregon. I have volunteer fire departments that have no paid staff on both ends of my district. So you look at that and you say, okay, you've got intense communities, developed communities, and you've got forest land and agricultural land. And I ask myself, am I a rural district? Am I an urban district? And the answer is that all of us hold many values that we in common. The rural-urban divide has really been politicized in the last few years. We've had individuals and organizations that have seen political advantage in trying to divide us. That's happened on the national level. And unfortunately, it's happened here in Oregon as well. And dividing us by rural or urban categories is one of the ways it's unfortunately been pretty effective in many ways. What the truth is, of course, as I look at my own district, that we all have the same things in common. We all want communities where we can be known, where we can raise our kids. We want schools that we can depend upon, where children can get educated and be ready to go out into the outside world. We need homes that are affordable and solid. We need neighborhoods. Those things look a little bit different in different parts of the state because of the characteristics of those communities. But fundamentally, all Oregonians are looking for the same thing. So the urban-rural divide is a political fabrication in my mind. And yet it is still sitting sort of the elephant in the middle of the room. So what we have figured out to do over time that I think has worked fairly well is when we're talking about climate issues, to be very careful in the words that we choose, to use language that can be heard by some of our colleagues whose districts will not allow them to talk about climate change or to publicly acknowledge climate change. We may not be able to talk about climate change, but if we can talk about renewable energy and the jobs that renewable energy can bring to communities and the economic development that can come with renewable energy. As an example, we can start to have a commonality. We don't have to, we need to be thoughtful in the words that we use and the ways that we talk about our issues so that we can find that common ground where we can actually converse and where we can move things forward. And I do want to say, I think that is happening. When we talked about 100% clean electricity a few years ago, that was in my committee, and Khanh was on that committee. We drove that bill through. And we rarely talked about the importance of 100% renewable electricity for climate impacts. But what we did talk about is how moving to 100% renewable electricity can bring jobs to communities. We talked about the ability to build microgrids and small renewable projects within communities that communities can own. We talked about economic development. We still didn't get a lot of Republican votes, but we didn't get pushed out the door either. And if you talk to our colleagues, many of them understand the issues that we're talking about, but the politics of their own districts don't allow them yet to actually vote for something that would be perceived within their districts as being a climate change piece of legislation. So I think there are ways we get around this. And I think being very thoughtful about how we engage, looking for those common threads in the issues that we care about that can be heard and can be discussed by people on different sides of the urban-rural spectrum is important. And I think to the extent that you are able to do so, really making allegiances across different kinds of communities. I don't know who all is on this call, but to the extent that you can develop a network of youth and youth organizations that spans the state, that includes Coos Bay and Medford, Oregon, and Portland and Malheur County, then you, just by having those relationships, can start to mend that urban-rural divide, because it's all about connecting with each other, understanding how things are different in different communities, and more than anything, really coming together to understand the shared values that we all have together.
Yeah, I would just echo what Pam said. I think youth can play a really important role in organizing across geographical divides. When you're in schools, often I don't know, I mean, this is just my dream, I'm putting out intentions, but I think it'd be so powerful to have kind of sister school relationships, even exchange programs. I went to visit my colleagues in Eastern Oregon last summer, and I found it incredibly helpful. And I almost wanted to have like an exchange program where we could like actually understand each other as a state. We have so much diversity in this state, and yet we share so much as well. And I think if there's ways that you can build relationships with, maybe you have a similar Red Cross club, and there's just a theater club. Sometimes I've heard like different choirs come visit, but the more that we can build those relationships in a really meaningful way, I think we can recognize that we are more united than we think. Before I joined the legislature, I was the interim director for the Oregon Just Transition Alliance, which I helped co-found. And the idea about this alliance was to unite what we call frontline communities, the communities that are hit first and hardest by the climate crisis, as well as all the different crises that we face. And it unites both frontline rural communities as well as frontline urban communities, because we know that we face so many of the same challenges and some of the same root causes when we look at when we really look at like why are our communities so underinvested? What are the forces that are organizing against being able to invest in our community solutions? We often went up against some of the same corporate forces, or it was the same kind of concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a small group of people. And I think that was tremendously enlightening to recognize our differences, but also to recognize there are some commonalities in some of our struggles. And so I think it's so important to really, as you're centering frontline communities, to recognize even frontline communities are pretty diverse across the state. And so how can we unite around our shared visions and values, as well as sometimes our shared enemies and opposition.
All right, that concludes our panel discussion. Thank you both so much for your insight. I'm really excited to work on these issues and see where our state goes. Now we're going to start taking some audience questions. We've had some great questions submitted, so let's see how many we can go through. Our first question comes from Yusuf. So Yusuf, the mic is yours.
Hi there. So I just graduated high school in the Portland area. I've grown up here my whole life. And I guess from the time I was born in 2005, I've always been constantly surrounded by this news of like walkouts, dysfunction in the state government. And that's obviously, from my interpretation, a result of the 2/3 quorum rules that Oregon has and very few other states have. So in order to make all the progress that we're really pushing for, like I appreciate and I understand that compromise is necessary now, but in order to make more progress down the line, is there any strategy politically or maybe from an advocacy standpoint that we can do to get around that 2/3 in terms of electing new members to fulfill that requirements? So how do you guys see that playing out for the climate movement in the future?
You're singing my tune, Yusuf. Thank you for that question. I feel like our arcane 2/3 majority requirement quorum is one of the most important democracy issues in Oregon right now. We are one of only 3 other states in the country that has a quorum requirement at this. This is the highest quorum requirement in the country. 46 other states, as well as the US Congress, just has a simple majority requirement. As long as you have 50% plus 1, if you have a majority, you can do business. And that's why we see in Washington, in California, even in Idaho and in Colorado, we don't see these kinds of walkouts that just shut down our government and threaten our ability to do the most basic functions, as well as the important lawmaking that we have to do. We were on the verge. There was a chance that we might not be able to pass our school budgets. Like there was a real risk if a small minority of Republicans or a small minority of just 10 senators really felt that strongly, they could absolutely stop the government from functioning. And that's a threat to our democracy. It's a threat to whether you're working on reproductive justice bills, whether you're working on education justice, whether you're working on reforming our criminal justice system, and definitely in environmental and climate action, this threatens any kind of progress on that. So I co-authored an op-ed in the Oregonian with my colleague, Representative David Gomberg, to call on our state to pass a ballot measure. We can refer it to the ballot. Unfortunately, we think likely that the same 10 Republicans will walk out to prevent us from referring it to the ballot. So really, it's going to have to probably come from a citizen-led initiative, which is going to have to be passed across the state, which is a huge undertaking, right? We have many districts who see this, who think changing the Constitution would be a really big deal, and so it's so important that we engage every sector, like I was mentioning, folks who care about abortion rights, healthcare, education, whatever issue. Everybody has to be talking about simple majority, moving to a simple majority requirement. I don't even use the word quorum anymore. I'm saying simple majority requirement, attendance requirement. We still have to work on the communication strategy talking point, but we need to do that if you want to have a functioning government. So I'm happy. I mean, please email my office if you're interested. And we're still trying to build, because it does take a lot of fundraising to pass a statewide ballot measure. It's millions of dollars. And so that's what funders are thinking about, is how much appetite do the people of Oregon have to change the Constitution. And I would argue that after years of repeated walkouts, there's a tremendous appetite to fix this and align with 46 other states.
And to be clear, I'll just add a word on that. We are being held hostage, right? We are unable to do and will be unable to do important policy, because if you can walk out, you can hold the agenda. During this session, we did get a compromise. People did come back. We negotiated. And in some ways, we had a good ending. We were able to pass the important budgets. We have some good policy pass, but this is not the way you want to do government. It was ugly. It was not transparent. It did not allow members of the public to participate in ways that they should be able to. And that's not the legacy that we need to have here in Oregon. So what Khanh is saying, I'm 100%, 200% in support of. We've got to change the rules, and that's going to can only be done by election, has to be a change in the Constitution, and will take people walking the streets and talking to people. There'll be plenty of ways to participate as we get that going.
Thank you both so much. Our next question is going to come from Naomi. If you want to come off camera now.
Hi. So my question is, where do legislators see the most room for positive climate action in Oregon, like transportation policy or like fighting new fossil fuel infrastructure, areas like that?
Well, I think there are, I'll just start here and we can do this in a more informal, interactive way. I think there are a number of fronts, and to some degree, it depends on what moves you. We are going to see in the next couple of years a huge rollout of investments in people's homes as a result of the federal legislation that's been passed. We have a tsunami of money coming to our communities. And so to the extent that we can really organize communities, help families make good choices about the kinds of upgrades that they might want for their homes, whether it's electric heat pumps or whether it's electric hot water heaters, or whether they need general upgrades to make sure that their homes are energy efficient. That's going to demand community-based organizations that really provide the interaction between people and the funding sources. It's going to require basically troops of navigators on the ground to help people figure out about the choices that are in front of them. I think you mentioned fossil fuels. I think that's been an issue that's really compelled, in particular, young people in the last few years. My community is the sort of base zero to the Jordan Cove pipeline, which was an issue down here for 10 or 15 years. And I want to say it was youth who stepped up in a very significant way to help lead that effort. And against all odds, that pipeline was turned back. It will not happen. At least it will not happen in the mode that it was proposed. That's really because we had youth come together, organize, and they did so many different interesting things to educate the community about what was going on with Jordan Cove and why it mattered, from hikes across the landscape to art projects to community gatherings, all of which was really part of the groundswell that kept Jordan Cove away. And there will be more, we have taken actions in the state to limit fossil fuel development. Part of 100% clean electricity was a requirement that our state no longer permit fossil fuel projects or significant expansions of fossil fuel projects. But we do know that there will be ways for people to propose pipelines coming through our state from other places, or the use of existing pipelines for certain kinds of fossil fuels. So that's a front that's unfortunately not going to go away. Fighting natural gas in our communities, helping people to understand what this held natural gas thing is all about. Because while many of us are exceptionally alarmed by the presence of natural gas in our communities, an awful lot of residents, even I'm going to say a lot of legislators, don't understand what the big deal is about. That's an issue that resonates with a lot of youth. So going out, really starting from a baseline to educate people why they should care about their gas stove, that's a fundamental issue. And it is that kind of education and engagement with communities, not unlike some of the kinds of engagement that we did around Jordan Cove in many different formats that will make a difference on the natural gas front. So I think the answer is, that was sort of a wishy-washy answer, because the fact is you can engage in multiple fronts, and it's sort of like, what is the issue that really grabs you and that you want to really dive into? Khanh, are you still with us? It looked like you froze at one moment.
Yeah, internet connection is choppy. So it was funny listening to Pam because your audio was just stretched out, elongated. But I just wanted to say, I think yes to everything that Rep. Marsh said. And of course, I've already talked about how transportation is important, but ultimately, I think all of these fronts, whether it's water, whether it's land and forest and agriculture, I think that we have to do two parallel strategies at the same time. We have to stop the bad. We have to move away from some of the really extractive, exploitative practice that we're entrenched in, while we're building the new, while we're building the 100% clean energy economy, while we're building this new transportation system that's accessible and safe for everybody. So I think I wouldn't argue that one is more important or one is most, I just think it depends on your conditions, your location, your own interests and passion. But I think there's just so many ways in this moment for us to contribute on multiple fronts. And unfortunately, we have to do it all at the same time.
Great question. Thanks, Naomi. Our next question comes from Adelaide Jeffrey. So Adelaide, go ahead.
Hi, so I remember that you mentioned underrepresented communities in the climate organization, and I was wondering if there are any organizations that you recommend getting involved with that center around those underrepresented communities and communities that are affected the most by climate change, or any other methods that you would recommend to get them more involved and to be more inclusive.
Khanh, do you want to take this one on as a starter? Oops, I'm not sure she's there. I'm going to say, I think youth organizations vary across the state. And so part of where you get involved is going to depend on where you live and what's available. In terms of the values of youth-based organizations, my experience is that the climate organizations that are attracting youth are also the ones that are really looking at underrepresented communities, because there is a desire there to engage and to create compacts among underrepresented communities, EJ issues, and youth issues. I think there's just a natural connection there that I see. In my part of the world, I've mentioned Road Climate, which started about 10 years ago by young people and continues to really actually drive policy within our community, and in a way that is really continues to engage youth at the high school level, the middle school level, and the young adult level. And in Portland, in the metro area, you have a different set of organizations that are available, and Khanh is more familiar with those than I am.
Yeah, I am. I think that I agree with what Pam is saying. I think we should start where we're at. And there are some nonprofits that are doing great work. I know Verde is doing really great work, as well as Opal and the Oregon Just Transition Alliance, which isn't so much an org, but more of a coalition of groups. Unite Oregon is really great too. But I guess I would really encourage folks to also think beyond just the nonprofits and the 501c3s. I think in this moment, we are going to need a lot of different formations. And in my experience as somebody who's worked for a decade outside of 501c3s when I was organizing, and I've also worked a decade inside 501c3s, I think there's pros and cons, but I definitely think that there are limitations. When I was in my 20s doing a lot of organizing work, it was all with volunteer collectives, which is challenging for sure to do it as a volunteer. But I think we also need to think about how do we, how do we do our own, how do we form our own organizations too? Because I just recognize that the amount of time it took to also fundraise for everyone's salary was also really exhausting. So I don't know which one's better, either being free and then totally under-resourced, or having resources, but then having to spend half your time fundraising for those resources. Sorry for that really negative answer. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say. I think there's a lot of organizations, but if there isn't one that really matches what you are particularly interested in, or your community, I would encourage you to think about organizing amongst yourselves, even if it's just a collective, like in your school, what can you do to make a difference?
Thank you so much. So our next question comes from Andrea, who is here with us tonight, but cannot currently unmute, so I'll be asking for her. So when you talk about environmental policies, what do you think about data centers that are destroying our agricultural land here in Oregon and hurting minority communities like farm workers?
So I'll start on this one, because we had a big data center conversation in the legislature this year. We had a bill that would have required that data centers that are located in the parts of our state that are served by our smaller utilities, so the utilities that do tend to use clean energy because they get their energy from the Bonneville Power Administration, and it's hydro, so it's fairly good energy, but they're not, those areas are not committed to 100% clean. So we said, if you're a data center and you're locating in that part of our state, which is about 25% of our state, then you should be responsible for providing 100% renewable energy for yourself. You should be on the same track that we have with our 100% clean electricity, so that by 2030, 80% of your power is coming from renewable sources. By 2050, 100%. It seemed pretty basic. And what we found was, I'm going to call them out, Amazon did everything possible to kill that bill, stepped up from the very first moments, showed up outside people's offices, skulked, trapped legislators, and managed to really make the bill managed to characterize the bill as an economic development blow to our rural Oregon areas. So we stepped back from that bill because we realized that it was going to be hard to move it forward, and that we would be better served by stepping back and reconnoitering and thinking about how to reapproach this issue. In the meantime, just since the session's been over, we've seen a couple of really critical data points. We've heard that electricity demand across the Northwest is going to increase by 25%. Just from background, this is not even particularly with the growth load from transportation or from new electrification sources. It's just the growth in electricity from current sources. We are also hearing that PGE, which of course is one of our big utilities, which is subject to 100% clean, is really struggling to cover its growth load, primarily from entities like data centers, because data centers, and we should have started this off in the conversation, data centers are these huge outliers in terms of energy consumption, which is why they pose so many problems for our rural utilities, because they force those utilities to go to the dirty energy market and to bring in fossil fuel based energy just to cover the needs of data centers. So it seems to me that we got to take this issue on statewide. We have to recognize that as we are all marching forward toward 100% clean, the outliers, those entities that are consuming disproportionate amounts of our electric provision, need to take some responsibility for where that energy comes from. And nobody can tell me, at least not to the extent that I will believe it, that data centers that are run by big corporations that are making lots of money are not in a position to cover their own energy needs. So this is it's a huge issue. We haven't even talked about water, because that's the other natural resource that data centers are really consuming in huge amounts. And it's going to be an interesting challenge, because a lot of people still see our data centers really still embrace data centers as bringing good jobs to communities. And that's where we have to do some strategizing with our friends in rural areas to say, we're not going to fight you on an economic development that you think is really important for your community. We just want that source, that data center, to make sure that it carries its own weight, so that it's not putting additional burden on your community to go out and find power and bring it in just to serve the data center. So it's a big conversation that has yet to come. And what we know now is it's not limited to one part of the state. It's really a conversation that we have to have for all utilities and across all regions.
I think that covered it. Thank you so much, Marsh.
Yep, thank you so much for that detailed answer. Our next question will be coming from Lily Stewart.
Hello, I am I'm starting my second year of college, and I live in Northeast Portland right now. And I was wondering whether either of you have examples you've seen of youth organizations, or even other organizations, if you don't have a lot of youth examples, that have done a good job networking across the state. Because like growing up, I've seen a lot of, strong organizing within the city and sometimes like the surrounding area, but not a lot across the state. So what might that look like? And have you seen examples of that being really successful?
Well, I will share, I think maybe some folks in this call might even be part of Sunrise, but Sunrise PDX was a place where a lot of youth, even from rural areas, would sometimes go meet, just because they didn't have one in their school. And then they ended up finding each other and then starting Sunrise Rural Oregon, which has had some of the most inspiring leaders that I've met, young youth leaders as well. And so I think they're an example, I think, of starting with the organization that's existing, which is kind of Portland branded, but then kind of spinning off to talk about the specific issues that are facing rural communities in Oregon. Again, also Oregon Just Transition Alliance, I think, has done a lot of good work in bringing together different groups to make connections. They have their own staff, but then they've been able to connect Adelante Mujeres in Forest Grove with Comunidades in Hood River, and then folks connecting folks in Eugene and Road Climate. And, so they have been able to build a powerful alliance that isn't young people per se, but so maybe that's not quite the right answer, but I think they've been able to build statewide in a way that through retreats, through these longer 3-day retreats that people can build relationships with, I think they've been able to build a really powerful alliance to speak with one voice about what frontline communities in Oregon need.
And I think I would just add, it's really important to know how successful that has been at different times. 2 years ago, OJTA built an alliance that came into the long session with the intention to pass 3 different bills. One was 100% clean electricity, check, pass that bill. One was healthy homes, which puts money out for vulnerable populations so that we can do home upgrades so that people can live in energy efficient, healthy environments. Pass that bill, check. And one was energy affordability. It was a bill that said that the Public Utility Commission should work with the big utilities to set up low income rate structure so that people who have less money pay less money for their utilities. Makes sense, but wasn't in effect at that point. That agenda was developed, was driven by was carried through with the coalition that was pulled together from youth organizations, from environmental justice organizations, from the conventional or the traditional climate advocates. And it absolutely worked. We passed all the bills, and we should feel pretty good about that. So coalitions work, being organized works, and I think that there is very definitely in these coalitions a really important place for youth organizations.
Thank you both. Yeah, I've had really great experiences with a lot of those organizations. They're really awesome people to connect with, and like you both said, build chapters in your own areas. So the next question is going to be coming from Eliza.
Thank you. Yeah, I was really interested this past session in SB 854, the climate change curriculum bill. I grew up in Douglas County, a small town, and I know that I never learned about climate change. It was never mentioned in any of my learning, and I know that permeates into the county and into people growing up as adults when, opportunities for higher education aren't always available to those rural communities. So often the only learning that is available to them is through K through 12. So I was just wondering, do you see a bill similar to that being passed in the future? And what kind of support would a bill like that need in order for it to be successful?
I'll start off here. I think there are a few challenges to passing that bill. One is that legislators walk very carefully around school curriculum. We try to not dictate more than we feel like we need to what is taught in our K-12 schools. So it's just it's a barrier to get an alignment around statewide changes to curriculum. So that's one thing. But the second question is really a question of strategy. So when I look at climate legislation that I want to pass, I know that everything that we try to do on climate is going to be a challenge. We just don't do any work on the climate space that brings all Republicans and Democrats together. That does not happen. So as I look at a bill and look at the political chits that we're going to have to put up to pass, I want to make sure that there's actually a benefit to the cost of that it's going to require to pass that bill. And I think the climate curriculum is one that I'm not sure meets that threshold. It would be great to have people learn about climate change. I think in many communities that's already happening, but it's probably still not happening in Douglas County, which is really unfortunate. And that's a bill that I would predict would become a lightning rod. What are you trying to do in schools? What are you trying to teach in schools? What are you trying to make decisions for local districts that they should be able to make for themselves. So with that, I have to, I have to make a calculation as to whether that's the best place to put my political leverage. And it's really helpful to me to hear your perspective that it matters, that it would matter for those young people, because that's really an important factor. And I have to look at that bill in terms of the realm of other legislation that we want to get passed at any one particular moment. So that's sort of the hard-nosed political analysis that we have to go through in thinking about what's going to be on our agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's much to add. I think it's going to people, they're always talking about unfunded mandates. Like, if we're going to do this, are we funding? The teachers are going to complain and say, like, or schools not complain. I think they're going to rightfully say, you keep putting more and more requirements on us to do this, teach about mental health, teach about, eating disorders, and then we don't give them the money. We keep underfunding schools and keep packing kids in. So it's just, I think it's something still worth exploring if it's important to young people. I think we are responsive to movements and organizations. So if it's a really important issue and people have a clear vision, I would encourage building a coalition, talking to OEA, the Oregon Educational Association, to say, like, what would it take? This is our idea. You could talk to the housing committee chair, who is on the House side, Rep. Courtney Miron, and I think talk to her about what she thinks about this issue. And I think she could walk through some of these considerations and what it would take to be able to pass it successfully. And what kind of coalition do we have to build? Because who's going to oppose it, and then figure out how do we address some of their concerns.
And then you just have to be clear it's your most important thing, or it's one of your most important things, because we don't get that many shots. So we have to be really strategic.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. Great question. So we're entering our last few questions, with this one coming from Jorge.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
I don't think I remember my question. Was it something that I submitted, or just my question, like something in my opinion in general?
I DM'd it to you, Jorge.
Oh, you did?
Yes. But one of the panelists can ask it in your stead if that's easier.
Yes, please.
All right, no problem. So Jorge's question was, what can youth actually do to make change other than just protest and all the basic stuff that is always told towards us?
Oh yeah, that I forgot. I'm in another meeting right now too, so my bad, my apologies.
I mean, I think that was the question that was asked earlier, right? Like, besides interning, besides just protesting, I think being organized. I think first of all, I think protesting is really important. I think direct action is really important, but policy making is having an impact on policies is really important. And I think what y'all are doing here is great. You're building a relationship with legislators who are really key legislators to build a relationship with. We both sit. I mean, Rep. Marsh is the chair of the House Climate, Energy, and Environment Committee. So we, I think organizing as young people, sharing your agenda and your top priorities. And I've been really consistently surprised at the power of just being clear and consistent about your demands, and saying it to as many decision makers as you can.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Jeffrey, who unfortunately couldn't make it tonight, but sent his question ahead of time. His question is, how did you get into politics, and what advice would you have for a high school or college student to become more engaged in politics?
I can take that. I mean, I think I was always involved in politics, and yet didn't know that. I always thought that I was kind of like, I had a very negative impression about politics. So I was always like, I'm going to be in the community. I'm not with those terrible people who are, corrupt and in politics. That just seems so corrupt. I was just really kind of grounding myself in communities and activists who would always just be really suspicious of people in elected office, or just people with power. To be honest, I think I've been afraid of power for much of my adult life. And I think it's a continuing lesson that I've grappled with to really learn what it means to wield power responsibly and in a way that's accountable to communities. I think I've had to unlearn, especially being a woman and coming from an immigrant community and more marginalized community. I think we're so used to being marginalized. It's very hard to actually claim power and to really wield it. And I think so it's only I'm 44, so I was just elected when I was 40, I guess. Or I ran for office when I was 40. I don't know. Anyways, this is my third year in session. It's all blurring. But I think I was just a community organizer and activist for many years, and built my understanding of what communities need just in community. And it was, frankly, somebody asked me to run and said that they would, communities asked me to run and said that they would support me. And in that moment, I felt so passionate about what we were doing. I was already building the Oregon Just Transition Alliance that people said something about fundraising, which I think applies to running for office, which is your fear your love for what you're doing has to outweigh your fear. And I decided to take the leap. But I think there's many roles that we play. I don't think being a politician is the only way that you can be political. And I think whether you're a fundraiser, you like to host house parties, whether you like to recruit, organize young people and recruit young people into more organizations, or whether you're just a really great social media person and can really tweet and really help frame the narratives. I think there's so many ways that we can contribute to a movement for social change. And we're having to transform so many different systems that there's so many different roles we can play, depending on your interests and your strengths.
So the only thing I would add to what Khanh said is, Khanh, when you said I was just a community activist, there is no just in being in that assignment. My pathway was being involved in my community, doing things that made a difference for my neighborhood, and just following sort of one strand for another to figure out where that went and how I could best contribute, whether it was on city commissions or whether it was on a city council, or eventually now whether it's in the legislature. Where I see young people getting engaged at this point is a very similar path, but probably even more driven by values. Where I see young people getting involved is because there's an issue that you care about. You become involved in climate change, you join Rogue Climate, you organize around that issue. And then for some younger people, a more political path has become an attractive in the course of working so hard on a topic area, in a subject area, in a community. And Khanh is right that the paths to be effective to forward this work that we all think is so important are multiple. It can be running for office. It can be organizing communities. It can be participating in activism. There's many different paths, and I think I think it's important to not worry too much about whether you're on the path, and to just follow the strands and see where they lead and what excites you and what feels effective.
Thank you both for sharing your.
Can I actually echo that? I really love that, because I get a lot of questions from young people. I remember when I was young, I was like, what am I supposed to do? And if anything, I still struggle at 44, like, what am I going to do next? But I think that the climate crisis has strangely made me more fearless about it. Like I feel like I don't have to follow the path, because the world that we're going to face now is so different from the world that our parents encountered, that the rules are not going to be the same. And so I really do think you have to trust yourself, like learn who you are, what your vision is, what you want to do. But it's both terrifying, but also very liberating to know that we're free to kind of chart our own path, and not follow necessarily any prescribed path for us.
Thank you both for sharing your stories and advice. So our last question from the audience comes from Roy.
Hello there. So as I understand it, there's a lot of renewable energy projects that are currently held up due to various causes, or just that there's some that don't get started because they're seen as being like either blockage or not enough funding or stuff like that. Who would be good groups or people to work with to help speed up the implementation of these projects and get more renewable energy installed?
That is a great question, Roy. And that is one of the big challenges on the climate front right now. We passed 100% clean. We set the policy in place. That doesn't mean we've achieved the policy. We achieve the policy if we actually start developing the kinds of renewable sources that we need to allow us to shift from coal or natural gas-based electricity to real renewable projects. And there are obstacles. There are siting obstacles, finding locations where we don't have land use conflicts and where renewable projects can feed into the transmission grid, because they've got to be located someplace where the power that's being produced can go into the grid. We have clearly funding issues. We have to work out relationships between renewable developers and the big utilities to make sure that renewable projects can feed into the big utilities and be used by them. We're working on this on a variety of different fronts. We have just passed legislation that will require the State Department of Energy to put together an energy strategy so that we're looking at all different kinds of renewable sources across the state, whether it's wind or solar or offshore wind or something we haven't even invented yet, or that isn't actually on the ground yet. We need to be thinking about all of those, understanding what kinds of uses they are best designed for, and creating a strategy so that we know what we want to pursue. That's a really important baseline effort. We have another group that's working on siting. We passed some legislation to fund a very diverse group of developers, of advocates, of land use people, of local governments, and others to look at the siting barriers so that wind projects or solar projects or offshore wind can find pathways so that we can do this more easily and get these projects out there more easily. We have to look at transmission because, as noted, these projects have to fit into the transmission lines, and our transmission lines are basically very limited at this point. And it's a long-term game to build more transmission. Can take years to get the approvals. We do not have years. We've got to look at that permitting process and figure out different pathways. So you put your finger on, the one of the elephants in the middle of the room, which is we can set the policy, but if we can't figure out how to implement the policy, we're never going to get there. And we're working on various fronts in doing so. I think one, in terms of what can, some of these are big, broad issues that people in power are going to have to look at. But I do think one arena that communities can look at is how we produce power on a local level. We are all talking about microgrids that will make communities both more resilient and the energy sources more renewable. Rogue Climate, here's another example. Rogue Climate just worked with the Phoenix Talent School District to get them $1 million grant from the state's community renewable program to start building a resilient campus within the school district and within our communities. So those, how we cite things, how we envision community renewable projects within our own neighborhoods, within our own cities and towns. In some ways, that's the really fundamental work that doesn't always have to wait for these big questions around siting and transmission to be resolved. We can start looking at what we want this to look like within community. And I think that's where I would suggest putting effort. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you, Pam.
All right, so thank you all so much for submitting those great questions. And for a couple minutes, we're going to turn the tables and have our guest panelists ask questions of us and our audience. So Rep. Pham, if you want to go first, if you have any questions for the youth attendees tonight. And if any of you want to come off of mute, please feel free to use the raise hand feature first. That way, not everyone is talking at once.
Thanks. This is interesting to kind of shift the mic. I guess I'm curious. I mean, I think I just want to hear from you about what are some of the challenges that you're facing in terms of saying, we've talked a lot about youth organizing. I'm curious, what are the challenges that either you're personally facing or that you're seeing some other youth organizers facing? And what are we missing from kind of the more like what you see in terms of environmental and climate legislation and policy making? What are some priorities that we're missing? But more like what are the challenges that you're facing?
Jorge, go ahead.
To answer that question, I mean, seeing that I've been doing it for like almost a year, probably like not being able to like get taken seriously, because like young age, like there's that idea like you're still young, you don't understand this. So like even like not just from like other people, but like definitely from parents too. But just like in general, like I probably got told that last week from like a person at City Hall. Like I was there protesting, and then this like man just, I think, wait, I don't remember who told me. Honestly, I'm just spacing out, but they simply just said like, you're still young. I don't know why you're doing this. Like, you don't understand how these things work, blah, blah, blah. And I just kind of like ignored it. But that's probably like the number one for me. I don't know about everyone else. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really frustrating because actually, in my experience, I think some of the smartest people who know exactly what's going on are young people. And sometimes the older we get, sometimes the most rigid and kind of narrow can be old. So I'm really sorry adults can be so narrow-minded.
Does anybody else have any other feedback?
If not, Rep. Marsh, do you have any questions for us?
I'm curious. You've heard us, Khanh and I have been talking now for an hour or more than an hour, and you've heard us talk on a variety of different things. And, you know, this is clearly a topic that we're both passionate about, that we've been working on. We're going to keep working. But what are we missing? What you've heard us jabber now for an hour. What have you not heard us talk about that you think is really important?
Well, I heard the climate change curriculum.
Yeah. Anything else?
Can I ask a question that's not climate related?
Lily, I saw you raise your hand. Did you have anything to say?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about kind of balancing, like I'd sort of written up, like looking at the current housing deficit in Portland. I think the latest number that I'd heard was like an 80,000 unit housing deficit, which is a really substantial number of people who don't have access to like safe, affordable housing. And to correct that requires a lot of new construction. And in that like construction or like creative reconstruction phase, one thing that I've noticed is a lot of green space and a lot of habitat for wildlife is some of the first to go, because it's some of the only like remaining land in the city. So I guess, what are things that we can do to protect wildlife and protect those habitats while also addressing the like housing needs that come with more building and expansion?
I think you have to do both, right? We have to build homes for people. You gave a Portland number statewide, we're missing 140,000 housing units. That is one of the reasons, the most significant reason that we have so many homeless people on the street is because we don't have enough housing. It's pretty basic. Where we build that housing and how we build that housing is the subject of a lot of debate. Whether or not we expand cities and build on farmland or take in additional land is a question that you can get legislators and regular people to debate endlessly. It does make sense to me that we use our land as efficiently as possible, which means building in more dense structures. And if you do that, at the same time, you need to make sure that there is some access to green for the people who live in those buildings, because that's what feeds the soul, right? You need to be housed, but you also need to feed the soul. So we need to be thoughtful, and we need to build up and densely when we can do that. And we need to make sure that it's not just concrete, that there's actually green space and places to recreate. Khanh really spearheaded the development of a piece of legislation that we passed in this session that's around trees and green infrastructure. And I think it was with those very same values in mind. And Khanh, do you want to talk about that a little bit? Oops, you're muted. Yeah,
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. Really briefly, it was the TREES Act, which created a Trees and Green Infrastructure Fund. It comes out of my experience as in HD 46, where we saw it was more low income communities, more BIPOC communities that have no shade. And so during the heat dome event, my district had one of the highest death rates because it was literally 20 degrees hotter than the wealthier, shadier parts of the city. And so, yeah, it's just, it's $7 million so that communities can build more urban forestry projects. And particularly for me, I think what was important was making sure we could prioritize schools, which have some of the lowest tree. Actually, I've heard we have lower numbers of trees than even certain industrial areas. And that provides a really unhealthy environment for kids during the now frequent heat waves. So I know there's a lot of questions, so I'm happy to chat more about it, but I just think shade equity is something that we're going to have to think more and more about as we face now recurring extreme heat wave events.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was asking about. The other part of that question that I had was about heat islands and
yeah, and it's
do them together, then there are consequences.
Yeah, the data in Portland is really showing the neighborhoods where temperature spikes because of the environment that's present.
Yep, thank you for your questions, Representatives Marsh and Pham. I think that's all the time we have for today. So I want to give a huge thank you to everyone in the audience for attending and for your great questions. And thank you so much again to Representatives Khanh, Pham, and Pam Marsh for their time today. We really loved your detailed responses, so thank you very much. And don't forget to follow us on our social media at OLCV to stay up to date and not miss out on more events like this in the future, including one next week. I'll pass it back to Stephanie one last time so you can learn how we can stay connected with OLCV.
Hey everyone, so like Yassine said, we're going to take a minute to just talk about how to stay involved with the OLCV. And before I talk about how to stay involved long-term, I want to mention the Youth Democracy Roundtable, which is on July 25th at 6 p.m. The link is in the chat to RSVP to that. And to stay involved long-term, OLCV has a really robust internship and fellowship program that myself and Yassine have participated in for over a year. So I've been a college fellow for a whole year now, and when I started with the OLCV, I was a geography major, just kind of looking for credit. I really wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do, but when I joined the OLCV, it became the most formative year of my life in terms of forming career goals and shaping what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I got a better understanding of the impact that I wanted to have on the world around me. So I would really encourage anyone here that's interested in policy and organizing and field work. The OLCV spans so many areas of environmental work. Please reach out about about college fellowships and high school internships, because it's a really great place to learn about yourself and your community. And it's really just one of the best places to work. It's one of the most supportive teams I've been on, and you make a real difference right from the start. So really encourage everybody to reach out.
Yep, that's it from us. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.